Hello everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the podcast. We are now on episode 8. Um and I decided to make this specific one as like a little checkpoint in between. We've been having guests left, right and center. I think there's not been a point where like I've discussed necessarily about like what's going on, especially because I've had a week break. I thought it's like a nice place to just have like a little catch up. Um, and then, yeah. I got a decent amount of time to think about the podcast during these. Well, it's been rather about 2 or 3 weeks because the last episode was with Callum and that was recorded at around the beginning or middle of the month. I recorded that one around like a week earlier than what it was released. Um, then I thought about the length of each episode. Um, and I sort of came to the conclusion that I sort of want to sort of think about making each episode shorter and possibly cutting it so then I record 2 episodes with each person essentially, even though the time would be the same for me. It would just be edited differently for you. But yeah, there's been a lot of thinking, a lot of things going on. So I wanted to outline some things that have happened in between now and then. Just some fun stuff, like where I've been, what's been going on. I think the first thing that happened in between now and then, between then and now, is I went to a concert. It was a very fun experience. I went with James, Liam, Ryan. Am I forgetting someone? I hope not. I think that's who it was. It's James, Liam, and Ryan. And we went and saw Benny. If there's any Benny fans, you'll be very excited upon this news. And I actually learned some really interesting things from the concert. So when I went to this concert, I was sort of intrigued by how I think what's happened is as I've started in, it's a bit loose of a term to call this content creation because it sort of is content creation, but it's a lot more personal. So it's not as serious as what Benny is doing and nowhere near to the size. But I learned quite valuable lessons. I think she taught me something interesting about like expression and art. Um, I think the way that she chooses to express herself, I think specifically in a concert. So me and my friends stood in this line, and then as we entered, we saw like a stage with a projector, and then there was like an opening show, and then out came Benny. And the first thing you would notice straight away is that she's got like a very interesting attire. She's like got like a how I described it in Big Hero 6, that big inflatable guy. That's what her top half sort of looked like. And then the bottom half was like I think it was like a dancer sort of vibe. And on her like what do you call them? On her legs, she had like little words written on it, which I found like really cool and really interesting. I also found it really bold because it's quite like a strong expression of like how she could have presented herself, right? And then that got me thinking a bit about how I think that showed me how like freeing it is to express yourself in a certain art form. I think it's really cool. Um, and I like how she also managed to do some stuff with the projector behind her. The way that she chose what to present, the way that she chose like certain lyrics to be um put up in the background. I just found it all really cool of experience. Um, the outfit was obviously the first thing that I noticed. And I walked in knowing basically only one of her songs, which was Super Lonely. Because in like 2020 or a little bit earlier than that, I think it was, it just went viral on like radio and all of that. So I remember hearing like her music from there. I thought it was like pretty funny, like the way that she would like. I've come to like an appreciation of like how certain artists can be like quite entertaining in the way that they present their music. I think Benny does this pretty well. There's like a bit of like, it's a lot of joy, like it's a very joyful, whimsical sort of experience listening to her music. So I thought that was really cool. Um, and then afterwards, after that concert, I found whenever I go to concerts, I usually take it as like a little advertising experience. So then I get to listen to more of their music. Although I'm probably gonna now seek out to go to concerts of people that I actually listen to as well. I think there's like a different dynamic that goes on there. But like I've added a bunch of songs to a playlist, and then I did a bit of research about it because I was vaguely interested in why she decides to present herself so like out there and so like bold. Is the way that I would put it. And upon doing some research, I actually found out that she has dyslexia, and it's played quite a big role in the way that she views things. She says that like things in her songs like don't make sense in an interview or a little article that was written about her. And I found it really interesting because she said it might not grammatically be correct, but it has a like really cool meaning, and that is like what makes her art, right? I think that like it kind of shows how individual art sort of like it, you have this idea of how like art is to be portrayed, like how you listen to music and how people present themselves in concerts. And I think like when you have a person like this come around, it sort of expands your limits, and it's not limited to that art form. It sort of extrapolates to other art forms, which I found quite motivating for myself. Um, and it got me thinking about the individuality of art. As a lot of my friends know, I'm very much like, as you can also probably tell from a lot of indirect signals from this podcast, like I take a lot of notes before I present my podcast. I'm very like um methodical and very like structured, and I think that there should be meaning behind things. And like I think through this experience, I sort of like a very Nicola style question sort of pops in my mind. Of like, I think in a lot of the times I've talked to him about the podcast, and I think what he says is like, does it like have to necessarily make sense? And I think that's like quite like a pointed question to this experience. And I think by like going to Benny's concert and thinking a bit about her as an artist and sort of applying it to like my new perspective, I sort of now understand that like, I guess art doesn't necessarily have to have a purpose or a meaning, but to me, it seems that it needs to have a meaning to me. I don't think it's like as important for it to have a meaning to everyone else, which I think is the beauty of it. It's like the more raw the self-expression becomes, the better it is, I think. Um, and yeah, it's like sort of like you're the primary audience to your art in a certain way, or you're like the primary bar that's been set. And I think that's what makes art beautiful. It's when you're able to fully express yourself. I think there's like times where I've heard a lot of stories about artists that go through this struggle. Um, there's a few artists that I know that always talk about this, where they have this balance of like art that they want to create and then art that will um, be used for like monetary means, like that they can sell and it can be like monetized. I think the beauty and the privilege of pursuing art, or I mean, it's quite loose to call podcasting an art form, but it is. Um, but the beauty of this is that you really get to have a moment where you're able to truly just be you. Um, I think that's super cool. And then I also found myself relating to Benny quite a bit upon doing further research into her. She says that she uses her art as some sort of vent. Um, and rather, it's a bit different for me, but still sort of similar. I find that like usually through this art form, I find myself given myself like a consistent experience that I can sort of build upon across time. Um, she also has this moment in the article that says, and I quote, "Oh shit, other people are going to hear this moment." And I find it quite amusing because there are times where I record myself saying some things and I'm like, oh, and like I listen back to them and sometimes have to cut them out or blurt them out. Um, it's really funny how usually when you're like in the momentum of art, it can seem as though like it's just you and, for example, the microphone or you and just speaking. But in reality, you are like sort of presenting to an audience, which is like a yeah, that in itself is quite an interesting experience. I think the experience of like recording for people to listen to is an interesting one. I try to avoid that sort of thing. I like the idea of the fact that my art form and my podcasting is so raw. Um, but yeah, that's why I related to Benny a lot. Um, Also, like I found that in the concert, she had a lot of moments where she connected to the audience really well. Um, I found that by not so I find that some artists and some people in the world, when they make something, whether it be art or a research paper or anything really, and they present it to the world, there are some people that sort of create a boundary in between themselves and the audience. And I think what Benny does well is that she breaks down this wall specifically because she knows that she's got like a spot where she can connect with people and give people like a nice connection to sort of motivate themselves in their lives. In many points in her concert, she would like stop in between songs and just speak to the audience. And I think that in itself is its own art form. And I found that really cool. As a person that does podcasting, I found like the way that you can utilize platform to be able to have really unique and interesting interactions is really cool. Also found it funny that in in the concert sort of vibe, there were these young teenage girls in front of us that were like screaming out to Benny, and they were trying to give her. I think they were trying to say that they love her music or something like that. It's really funny how, because like the way that audition is like set up in like auditory acoustics, that's the word, acoustics is set up inside of the like hall. It's really funny seeing Benny like look exactly to the opposite side of the room. Um but it was really also wholesome that like you can have such an accessible means of interaction with a person that you look up to. And I think these teenage girls looked up to Benny quite a bit, which is really nice. That's really sweet, especially of someone her size. I think she's quite like a medium sized artist. Like she's not incredibly popular, but she's not also incredibly small. Like I think she's got like a pretty sizable audience. So it's still nice to see her cling on to a lot of things. In fact, in the article that I read about her, it was interesting to hear about how she clings on to her roots. She talks about her New Zealand background, and the reporter asked her, because Benny has had like international experience performing at massive concerts. It's funny that when the reporter asked her what her favorite experiences were, she always resorted back to very localized New Zealand sort of like events that meant a lot, and they do mean a lot. She said that there was a concert that was held after Christchurch as a way to bring the community together, and she got asked to like perform at it, and she thought that that was one of her best experiences. And there was also like a Maori thing event that she got to perform on, and it was really sweet seeing how she doesn't ditch her heritage, although she does have incentives to appease such a global audience. It's sort of like a somewhat a bold move to to hold tight to one's background, and I really appreciated that. Yeah, so that's one thing that I've been up to over the past few weeks. Another thing that I've been up to, which is a big thing for me, has been the GAMSAT. As many of you may know, many of you people that personally know me will know. Um, it's quite tough to announce this on such a public platform, but yeah, and this is a bit of a like, oh shit, other people are gonna hear this. I'm sure when I hear myself um in post, I would be like, oh, I don't know whether like I want other people to hear this or not, but you know what? It's whatever. This is my authentic raw art form. I do want to do medicine. It is one of my big dreams. So I've been really working hard towards this exam. And there was like actually quite a few insights from this exam. But before I give those insights, I think I'm going to give some background. I think ever since I was young, I felt like there was like a level of like duty that I had because I've been gifted with a inquisitive mind that can be used in a way that can really help other people. I felt like a sense of duty to reach the heights of getting to a medical degree and practicing as a proper professional within the workplace, within the medical workplace. And then also, I had a few role models. I have two uncles in Pakistan that like really showed me what a good doctor looks like. And just hearing their experiences, they told me a lot of experiences in between their patients. Just hearing like how someone can be more than just a doctor and how they can be rather like a community member that they can be looked up to, where like people can come up to them for various issues and they're a trusted member in their lives, and how you can sort of foster that sort of relationship with people was really motivating to me. So naturally, after year 12 or during year 12, I did sit the UCAT. But then at that time, I felt like it wasn't the right time for med for me. I just wasn't as invested at that time. I sort of wanted to get into the degree I'm doing now, which is biomedical engineering and neuroscience. So now I'm getting to the end of this degree, and now really I feel like it's the time for me to get into med. I feel like I've got such nice experiences from engineering and science that I feel like it'll feel really well into med. Which means that it's come to the time of my degree, my second last year, where I should really be looking into this exam, which is quite stressful because it's like kind of like I think in the Alchemist, which is a book that I was reading over the past month, there's this idea of someone's life, like a life moral that you live by, or like not life moral. It's like your individual journey. I forget which word they use, but they use a very strong word for this. But it's like someone's like purpose, basically. It's like finding your life purpose, and this is like this feels like the thing that like I'm like trying to reach for. So this exam has been somewhat stressful, although you can take it every half year, so that does relieve some nerves. Um, but yeah, I learned quite a few things from. So I did also I did an attempt about 2 years ago, and just for like general structuring and to understand how the exam is, sort of went in with no study, did an attempt, and found the environment very intimidating. It was a very like stressed environment. You could tell everyone was very, very much, because you have people that are very hopeful. Only so many people can make it into a medical course here because like of government funding and other various means, various like issues within medical admission. Um, but yeah, it was a very tense sort of environment. And then a few years later, or a year later, after I sat that exam, they changed it so one of the parts would be online and one of them would be in person. So instead of being one big block of an exam, you did one part online, one part in person. The part online was the part that I just sat. That was the essay component. So in this exam, you've got to basically produce two written pieces within an hour, which basically to most people, including myself, who enjoys structure and everything, is pretty much just writing like two essays in an hour. People in the past have produced like poetry and narratives, but I don't think I've got that skill necessarily, and I think an essay is like a really cool thing to learn. So I've been, yeah, I spent around like a dedicated month and a half of studying, which is quite a short time for this. But I learned quite a few things. I wrote around 20 essays in prep, and I discovered a lot about argumentation and how someone is to develop an argument in the form of an essay. It's really interesting, like reading a certain quote and reading maybe a few quotes here and there, and then trying to develop an argument either for or against that quote, or creating a new argument around that quote. and then sort of dividing that into 3 points. I think one of my first struggles when I started this process was dividing it, dividing an argument into 3 parts. Um, but as I went on, I figured out that it's not necessarily that you have to divide something into three arguments. It's like a natural flow. You can have like an argument which asks, like, which begs a question basically, and you can sort of just address that question as you go on. I learned a lot about flow, and I learned a lot about just how quickly one of my strongest weaknesses can be shifted into like a, well, it's hard to call it a strength still, but like a moderate skill. Um, but yeah, like I also learned how many topics there are. In terms of an essay, I've only really thought about certain philosophical topics, but I think through the process of writing so many essays across diverse topics, I've written essays on travel, written essays on originality, on religion, on politics, on love, and on like a bunch of topics all around the place. I think like it was a really cool experience, sort of developing ideas. I think I'm naturally predisposed towards wanting to do this sort of thing. So it ended up being like a lot of fun to sort of study. Um, but yeah, I spent a lot of time studying, and then as the day came up, and as the day approached, um, I had to read a bit about what's actually going to happen during this exam. And it was a proctored exam, which basically means there is live monitoring of you sitting the exam, which was a really interesting experience. So before jumping into this exam, you sort of had to set up your workspace, or at least I thought you would have to set up your workspace such that it would be clear that you're not cheating, or at least in my case, I didn't want to be flagged for anything like that, so I went quite a bit extreme. I actually transformed my entire room into quite like a dehumanized sort of shell of what it used to be. Um, I think even the process of this was fascinating. Just seeing my room from once having a neuro, I have a brain anatomy poster in my room. I've got a few books lying. I've got a lot of books lying around on my table. I've got like a little model of a brain. I've got some sunglasses. I've got even like hats and stuff like that lying around on my table just as decorative pieces. And I've got a little like music album. And just like seeing my room without all of that, it just felt like a very interesting experience. So there was that. And I think after going through and deconstructing my room down to its basics pretty much, um, I think the reality of the exam sort of hit, and it was very interesting. I found another interesting effect that happened. I found that like in my exam, if I needed to recall something, I would remember something on my table in front of me, which was there. I found that like by things not being there, they became more apparent. Like those books that I was remembering on my table that I would just not really pay too much attention to or take too much notice to, which I found like a really interesting experience. Um, Another really interesting experience from the proctored exam was that they had this rule where you had to stay quiet. I actually found this rule really funny. I mean, like, there's no one sitting around. I don't know why they were trying to get us to be quiet. It's an interesting rule about how you're not meant to read the question out loud. Um, I think that might be like in hindsight. So during the spur of the moment, it felt really weird that you couldn't read the question out loud. I whisper the question myself whenever I see it, just so like I can sort of like process it. Um, but it was like interesting that you couldn't do that. But now in hindsight, um, I think this is to prevent like tutoring companies from cheating, by like not having like someone outside like transcribing like the essay questions and like using the quotes and stuff. Um, but yeah, like it was definitely a really interesting experience. Then yeah, so I sat down for this exam. You had to do a whole scan of your room, so you had to like show like move your laptop around and show every corner of your room. I went extreme. I even showed like the ceiling and the walls and everything like that, just so like the marker, or like not the marker, the person that was um, watching me do my exam 100% knew it wasn't cheating. I had my little whiteboard next to me and my marker, which I showed as well. Um, and yeah, and then just making sure I haven't forgotten anything. Yeah, and then I started my exam. Ends up they gave you an extra 5 minutes in the exam, which was actually really sweet because I got some time to edit, like 3 minutes to just quickly skim over everything, make sure everything's there. And yeah, they gave us like an hour, 5 minutes. It seemed to go pretty well. I yeah, and then I found it that it was really good. My practice was really good because I did essays in groups of two, like as you would do in the final essay uh, essay that you would write for your exam. I did it in groups of two and timed it for an hour, so I sort of knew that even if one essay goes a little bit over time, like you write it in 35 minutes instead of 30 minutes, you can like accompany for that because the second group of topics tend to be easier than the first for me, because first topics are meant to be like more like philosophical in the realms of like government, in terms of power, in terms of like the more serious topics. The second topic was more like your social or literary sort of topics. So this could be like love or connection or like choice or like things like that, like more of those ones. Um, so like I finished my first essay in about 35 minutes, finished my second in another like 30ish minutes, or a little bit less, and then I got some time to edit, which was very nice. There's someone mowing their lawn outside. Hopefully, none of that audio is coming to you guys. I do have some noise cancelling to this, but yeah. Um, but yeah, I was quite relieved. And currently, this is one day after sitting the exam. I'm currently very relieved that I went through this experience. I feel like, as you might be able to tell, maybe if you compare this episode with the pilot episode, you might be able to tell the difference in between. Because I feel it internally that there's a difference in between the way that I can articulate myself, um, and I feel like that's changed a decent amount since I started studying, and I'm quite grateful for it. In fact, I've told people that I wouldn't even mind going through this study process again because it ended up not being so torturous. Like, I think the initial stage ends up being a bit torturous. You're like, I don't know anything about essays. Like, I don't know where to even start. Like, I know what I'm writing is bad, but I don't know what to do from here. In my study, I actually found ChatGPT to be a really good resource in terms of feedback. What I did was I prompted it to specifically not rewrite anything because I really wanted to keep my creativity. I think one aspect about AI and use of AI for feedback is that it can dim our instincts and dim our senses for um, future like sort of like creative impulses or like creative impulses in general. And I don't want it to do that. And I actually encourage anyone that's like writing essay writing, if they want to have some feedback, it could be good to go through ChatGPT and just asking it. Like, there were times where it gave me like prompts like, "Oh, you seem to lack clarity," and that seems to be like a really general sort of feedback. But I rewrote I made some edits to improve clarity within my essay, and it seemed like I was able to individually be able to do it without the help of like a prompt that gave me exactly where and why and how to do these things. So that was really cool. So the use of AI was really cool in my study. Previous to this study, I've been quite against the use of AI, as you can probably tell with my use of AI in this time as well. Um, I don't know, I take quite a boring perspective to AI that a lot of educational institutions would probably take, where I actually think that it's a scary tool to use in the way that you don't want to drain your ability to be able to create. In fact, I've started this podcast. One of the reasons is because I understand in the world that we live in today how strong of a skill it is to be creative and be authentically creative. I think we're given so much outlet to be creative, but to be authentically creative is slowly being taken away from us, and this is like my sort of like way of keeping something like that. Um, but yeah, um, GAMSAT study. So another aspect of my study was a lot about strategy. I was stuck a lot towards the end of my study because I knew on the day before and on the day itself, I didn't really know how to navigate that sort of circumstance. I come from a background of engineering and science where all of our exams, you just review flashcards if you need on the day and you sort of just chill. But essays feel a little bit different because they're sort of like, I don't know, the whole experience of taking like an essay for like an exam, it's kind of scary because you think that, or at least one instinctual, well, one natural impulse that I found myself going down was thinking that, oh, like I might not be able to write under the like, if they give me a topic that throws me off, like what am I gonna do? Like, yeah, what's gonna happen there? So that was a bit stressful. And then I realized as I entered, and I actually used AI, and sort of um, let it know like what sort of arguments I was coming up with to see what it would come up with. And I found like its counter argument quite good. Um, Again, I don't want to sound like one of those AI nerds that go, oh well, like AI knew what sort of emotions I was going through and provided me with such a in-depth analysis that is so beyond human. I don't think that. I think that like AI sort of takes a mix of just it just uses a bunch of language models with not much in it. Um, but like it's good to test it and then to see if you're able to gain meaning. I think it's rather from these AI systems, it's rather your interpretation of what it gives you that gives it meaning. There's a lot of slop that gets produced from AI, and I think it's important to be able to recognize that not everything that it produces is going to be good. Um, but yeah, it kind of taught me that um, it told me that um, wait, let me just recap because I went on a bit of a tangent there. I told it my stresses, and then it told me basically that it's a sign of strength, which I think is true. That if you're no longer questioning whether or not you're able to perform on a baseline standard, you're now questioning to a higher order ability of like whether something will throw you off, which means you're prepared and you're stressed for the randomness of the circumstance, which is a good thing. I think that sort of reframing was really good for me, especially during that last day, or like during the day of. So that was really cool. Um, and then also through the writing process, I also figured out something that I haven't actually felt too much in my life, which is as I was writing essays, my um, my sort of all of my algorithms throughout YouTube, throughout, or mainly through Instagram, sort of got shifted towards poetry. I sort of started seeing how words can really cause an impact into someone's like, I don't know, I just felt so much emotion from reading words. It was really cool discovering that sort of aspect of it. And you would see through the course of these, like the reason why I've got media segment inside of this podcast is specifically because of that. Through this process and through process of creating podcasts as well, I've sort of figured out how words and things that you see can actually create quite moving emotions that I think ought to be shared. I think you have like a duty to share that with people. Or at least in my case, I think I do. I've got like a lot of people in my life that I think would really like to hear them. And I think it's really cool to be able to do that. Um, yeah. Um, and what else do I have here? Yeah, another thing that I found out through this essay writing process was I got humbled quite a bit. Ends up I don't actually know much about things, um, and I need to. I sort of figured out that a lot of people. I'm not sure which case it is, whether it is that people speak without knowing anything, or whether people actually know things when they speak, or people just pretend like they know things when they speak. But like I'm starting to notice over time. especially through hearing a lot about politics and stuff and having so many discussions of that regard, it's really hard to form an opinion of any sort. I think it's in the world that we live in today, it's so you're so quick to get shouted down by either side that you're not really able to explore certain opinions. Essay writing is a really cool way to explore an opinion. Podcasting is also a really cool way to explore an opinion. I think one reason that people hate podcasts is because there's so many stupid people running podcasts. But I think that's part of its art form. I think by sort of, it's sort of like similar experience happens when I read a book. I might think the author is dumb or I don't resonate with certain parts of the book, but at the end of the day, when you're reading a book, you kind of just have to sit through and listen to what they have to say. You can't put a comment under the book. You can't dislike a book. You can't like react to the book in a way that the book would realize. You just sort of have to sit through it. And I think the experience of sitting down, this sort of like, I think you have to. It sort of links into something that I was reading about, like into the idea of stoicism, about how you have to just sit through and understand that other people's opinions are like sort of uncontrollable to a certain extent, but you also, I think, to extend that, you shouldn't control them as well. To like, you should allow other people to explore their opinions. I think by shutting down so much, what's happened is that we we're pushed towards less intellectual conclusions. I think we really see this in American politics, especially. And in the West in general, there's this culture of whenever there's a movement, you want to shut it down as quickly as possible and complain about it as much as possible, rather than seeing the pros and cons of it and properly evaluating it for what it's like, for its entire strength and weakness. Um, However, it is a global problem as well. But I've noticed this, and it's just an interesting observation that I've made. Um, but yeah, this is almost the end of this. How long have we been going for? 35-ish minutes. I think at this point, I'm going to go through the last segment because this is going to be a bit of a shortened podcast because it's a little progress check. See how things have been. It's a little break in between the guests as well. Yeah, I'll give you guys some time to catch up with everything. I hope everyone's caught up by now. Um, if not, like, that's fine. That's up to you guys. But yeah, the media of the week this week. So I decided this week I was going to um, talk about a book that I was gifted recently. I was gifted this by Mel. Thank you, Mel. This is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I know many of you would have read this when you were younger, and my sister did read this when she was younger, but I never really got into books or anything of that sort. So yeah, it was quite an interesting experience reading this because I've been around at the beginning of my literary journey reading. Um, it was kind of cool to have such a change of pace into like a children's sort of book. You can see in certain spots where C.S. Lewis actually addresses the audience, and sort of speaks in a way of like a, it's sort of like as you're reading the book, it's sort of like an uncle's sort of retelling you a story. There's points in the book where he's like, I actually can't explain this to you because then your parents would get mad at me, which is a really funny representation. Um, yeah, so I wanted to go through a few little parts of this book. So yeah, I think to begin, when talking about this book, I wanted to talk about the little note that C.S. Lewis leaves at the front. Um, this is directed to his Dear Lucy, which is one of the main characters of this book. He says, My dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it, I had not realized that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales, and by the time it is printed and bound, you will be older still. But someday you will be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. You can then take it down from some upper shelf, dust it, and tell me what you think of it. I shall probably be too deaf to hear and too old to understand a word you say, but I shall still be. Your affectionate godfather, C.S. Lewis. I thought this is a beautiful little moral behind making a book. Sort of links into some like aspects of this podcast for myself. It's sort of like a little um, like I find it really interesting how he's sort of addressing his. So initially, the intention was for his daughter at an age of consuming fairy tales, but then he sort of is now addressing it to a far older version of his daughter. And I sort of personally sort of like um, relate to that because I'm sort of like addressing these podcasts to my future self in some ways. Like I sort of like how I can sort of have this sort of as a point in time where I'm expressing like certain ideas and topics, and then in the future, I can sort of reflect back to them, and I can be like, oh, look how dumb this guy was, or look how interesting this guy's perspectives were, and then think about like, oh, things have changed so much through time. This is the struggles and this is precisely why I really wanted to go through GAMSAT and the concert. I felt like having these life events, like in the future, I can sort of recall on them, and although I might forget that they were there temporarily, I can go back to this episode and possibly like listen to it and be like, oh, this was the time in my life where this happened. Like I listened to the Benny concert and it really transformed the way that I saw art, or like I did the GAMSAT and it was a really stressful circumstance. I feel like that's like a really sweet sort of way to produce art. Um, yeah, so I had the second of the three things that I wanted to go through in this book was a little description of Aslan. Aslan is a character in this book that is described in a lot of different ways. Um, and I thought that it was really interesting how descriptions were made in this story because I've been reading a lot of international books. It's really interesting hearing like the way that a children's book sort of illustrates something. There's a lot of like, yeah, it's really interesting. Um, so the beaver in this story says they say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps he has already landed. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was, any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it has some enormous meaning. Either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get the dream again. It was like that now. Um, yeah, and I thought like that was a really cool way to describe something. Like it was just really cool that you can describe like a character in like that sort of regard. Um, but yeah, like I just haven't heard of like I think C.S. Lewis does a lot of like breaking the third wall sort of descriptions that is really cool. And I thought that was one example of it. And the character of Aslan is described as both scary and protective in some ways. And I think some parts of him like go against each other, which is really interesting to see how different characters in the book also view Aslan. Um, yeah. I also found like it sometimes has like little value. It has like little lesson descriptions, which is really cool. So, for example, in this quote, in this final part of the book that I will describe, people who have not been in Narnia sometimes think that a thing cannot be good and terrible at the same time. If the children had ever thought so, they were cured of it now. For when they tried to look at Aslan's face, they caught a glimpse of the golden mane and the great royal solemn's overwhelming eyes. And then they found they couldn't look at him and went all trembly. Again, this is another description of Aslan. Aslan in general, I think he's regarded as one of the most interesting people in this book. Um, but there's also other characters that have very strong, interesting elements. But I think yeah, like just the way that the author chooses to describe um, his characters, it's just so interesting, and the way that he links in this idea of like I think what Aslan's character does as well is that it it sort of like introduces a child into this idea of like how complex characters can exist, where they aren't all good or all bad, or they aren't necessarily one way or another. It's a really cool way to be able to introduce the child to that concept. And it's also just a fun experience to be like like sort of sometimes by you viewing this breakdown of things to their foundations and expressed in such a way, you're able to appreciate not only the level of understanding you have, but like appreciate how these things were taught to you through time, like through experiences of your own. Like I think there's a lot of experiences that like I've gone through that have been like very interesting in the way that like I've concluded that things aren't necessarily all good or all bad. They're just very complicated and they're just very complex. I think it's really good to introduce this sort of concept to a child. But yes, um, unfortunately, this is the length of this episode. It would only be probably a bit over half an hour of an episode. Um, Unfortunately, to all you fans of the long episodes, that will be now a lost form for a little bit of time. Um, but yeah, I've decided to change up the length such that it's more manageable for me and more manageable for a lot of the audience, which have other things to do with their life, and they should. Their life shouldn't just be listening to me. Um, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And yeah, and I hope you got something out of it, and you enjoyed hearing out where I've been for the past 2 weeks and the little transformations that have occurred in my life. Um, I'm always happy for like a little conversation to happen in the comments. If you have some like insightful questions or anything like that, and if you know me personally, please always message me. Like, let me know. James has told me that he's always in the boat where he feels like he wants to say something, but he's just listening to me speak, and he's one of my closest friends, and I'm like, just message me, just let me know what you're thinking. I just find it very interesting. A lot of the time I do forget what's going on in a lot of these podcasts, but I'm always really happy to hear out how people perceive my work and how they um yeah and also yeah, tomorrow I'll be filming the next episode. So get excited, people. There'll be two 1 hour long episodes filmed tomorrow, or maybe one hour long, depending on how it goes. And I hope you enjoy next week's guest, as he's quite a unique guest compared to the rest. I mean, everyone's been a unique guest, but yeah. Anyways, we'll wrap things up here. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, thank you very much, guys. Bye bye.